Hey, LoriKim, how are you?
Hey, Jamie, I'm good today. I'm well, thank
Good, good.
you.
Despite the rain in the Bronx.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. It's great to get the chance to have a conversation. I heard you on our hen house. I was lucky enough to be a guest there a while back, and your story was fascinating. So it's great to get the chance to explore these crazily broad questions with you. And as you know already, it's a series of conversations about, I guess, the two deepest philosophical questions. What's real, what should we believe, and what matters and who matters. So epistemology and ethics. And I have a clear bias because I'm trying to normalize and develop this really simple worldview called sentientism, which suggests that when it comes to thinking about what to believe, we should take a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason. And when it comes to who matters and who warrants our compassion, our moral consideration, that should be all sentient beings, any being that has the capacity to suffer or flourish. But I'm lucky in these conversations to talk to a wide variety of people who both agree or disagree with that worldview. So it'll be great to understand your story and where your thinking has got to now. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself for people who don't know of your work?
Thanks so much for allowing me to the grace to introduce myself the way I want. So sometimes a bio can get really stuffy and stale. Um, the easiest way is my whole name is LoriKim Alexander. But you can call me Lori Kim. And my pronouns are she, her, and we, our. And, I'm a lot of things in a lot of spaces. I'm an educator, I'm an organizer, an activist, a conservationist. I'm a naturalist as well. And I also am an abolitionist and a healer. And I use all of that kind of synergize everything into, Black liberation practice. And that's always got a queer and vegan lens to it. So that's the type of things that I do.
Yeah, that's a great taster, and I'm sure we'll explore many of those themes as we go through these big conversations. Thank you. So let's start with the first of those questions: what's real or what to believe. So for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up in maybe a more supernatural, mystical, religious context, family and society, or one that was more naturalistic, maybe scientifically minded, maybe more atheist agnostic, and how their thinking has changed over time, if it has, on what the universe is and how we should best understand it. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like to tell that story.
Yeah, thank you. So, I grew up in Kingston, Jamaica, in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, however you want to categorize it. And, it's a Black country. And we didn't get independence from the UK until 1962,
Yeah, it was late.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah. So, like most of the Caribbean, actually, and lots of Africa, was around the same time right after civil rights. So I talk about it in that way because I want to set the baseline. Because being a Black country, what that means is that we had to we had to really hold tight to our traditions, our histories that were muddled, removed, and you know, subsequently, and like also stripped, because of the slave trade, because of slavery,
yeah,
chattel slavery, and so that's never not going to be real. And so what also is real is the fact that we're highly colonized. And I don't even know if there's anything as lightly colonized either, right? So, and when I say highly, I mean that Jamaica was one of the countries where these slave ships would come and offload human beings, but it was really very restricted because there was a lot of, for lack of a better word, lawlessness by the traders, by what are known as pirates, all of that. And so there were these insane laws, just really stringent laws on Jamaica that really created a system that was highly carceral. And in that, too, a lot of missionaries saw opportunity to come in and bring their various and sundry versions of the truth, of which is, some sort of religion. And what happened there is, oh, in order, also the story goes, and whether or not it is true, remains to be seen. But a lot of folks have written about the fact that Jamaica and a couple other islands in the Caribbean were where they would drop off the most warlike, of the enslaved Africans. And so it was also with that, people are coming into mind that they're going to domesticate these people, right, to make them work.
That's the mindset, yeah.
Right, all of these things. Meanwhile, people are just trying to survive and have their own rich, deep traditions. But the only way to really practice them without, being murdered or, degraded and denigrated was to find ways to synchronize it into what these missionaries are bringing. So Christianity is very, very much a big part of Jamaica. And for me, I grew up Catholic, and in my household, that doesn't mean Catholic in the way that a lot of people around the world see it, which is, everyone has, all these babies and all of these things. No, that's not the thing. It's just really a form of worship that's like very structured and steeped in Rome.
Yeah.
And a very white and blonde Jesus. My grandmother had a puzzle that she'd glued together, or someone had glued together for her and framed with this blonde Jesus that was in the living room that I would see.
Right. How did that strike you as a child?
Yeah, as a child, I was just kind of like, this is not someone that I can relate to, just like Santa Claus. I never believed in Santa Claus. So, again, giving you all this background to have you realize that, this is what I grew up under, looking at religion, not as the framer of my world, but as the framework I had to live under in order to go about my daily life, right?
Yeah.
Like first communion, all of that. And so
it's just like a machine, a social process, and you don't really have a choice but to just participate. That's just what you do, I guess.
Right, exactly. And so, I would have to say rosary, all of these things, and I would do it as a punishment, honestly. For me, that's what it felt like. And I had to pray every night. And so I would pray to Jesus like you asked Santa for a Barbie, So these are the things that I would do. So it wasn't until but in my mind, in my head as a child, what I saw in the natural world did not reflect this idea that, God created all of these things. I watched creation happen. I was one of those children that was like transfixed by all the little creatures that lived with us,
Yeah.
And so also, by the time I was 14, I'd been in the US now a year. And I was really grateful to just start to meet new and different people, and really start to work through the things that I'd been mulling around in my head as a child, which was, this religion doesn't make any sense to me. It's providing information that did not, just it didn't work well. I love the idea of angels watching over us. I love the idea of someone who would die for you without knowing you. I loved that.
Yeah.
But the way that it was presented in these bodies that were foreign, that was somehow I'm supposed to hold as mine, made no sense. I couldn't see them and I couldn't feel them. They weren't who whispered to me, in my ear. They weren't the intuition that I felt, and they weren't the ancestors that I knew.
Yeah.
And so I decided I'm not going to go to church anymore, and in Jamaica, we call it like you broke out, right? So I didn't go to church. I came out, at 14 years old.
Yeah.
I stopped eating meat, all of those things, because I could not equate this idea of, just loving um, all beings, right? And loving non-humans and also eating them. And that's when I got really involved in animal liberation
So all the
movement
changes at once. You basically just
all at once.
press the button and said, "Let's do it."
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Thank you. And so on this, and we'll come on to, because it's so hard to disconnect this question about what's real from the ethics. And you've already started to hint there at how you were thinking about non-human animals, for example. But while we stay on this question of what's real, how has your thinking changed since then? So I guess you broke away from Catholicism. Where did you go after that? Because I've had guests who've left a sort of established religion and gone to another. I've had guests that left an established religion and become maybe spiritual but not religious. So they have a sense of sort of transcendence and spirit and connectedness and, a sense of the mystical and the magical even, but it's not about an established religion because of some of the institutional problems. And other people like me have just sort of followed a fairly boring path towards a naturalistic sort of atheistic or agnostic, I just believe in reality around me and that's it. How's your thinking on that front shifted? Have you followed one of those paths or something else? How would you describe it?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So, first of all, I don't think that's boring at all. Actually, that's very interesting to me, and to me, it's something that I thought I followed too for a while. So at first, I was like, no. That's when I first learned about what atheism was, and I said, yes, I'm an atheist. I don't believe any of this. You know, However, spirit moves you, So there is no way that the full flush of brilliance of the the beautiful striving and creation that is my ancestry, you know, couldn't come through to talk to me. So I would have these, I don't even know what to call it, and I feel like I get chills even when I think about it. Like these conversations that I thought I was, kind of, that was me talking to myself, but really, there was something that, when you say like something told me, you know,
Yeah.
there's a something that was telling me. Somehow I would ask for things in my head and it would happen. Somehow I would just make crazy decisions. I made wild decisions, for things that I knew that wouldn't, it just couldn't happen, but I'm going to make it happen. And somehow it would. And so I started to really look through, what is the tradition that I came from? What are
Yeah.
these things? And so I realized I never really strayed away from thinking about the world beyond, looking at, you know, the space and time that we're in as a continuum that is attached to other continuums, right? Believing in a multitude of universes, that's when I got into science. I was always very, very into science, but that's when I really started to understand that, oh, there's people who put numbers to these things, you
Yeah.
know? So a lot of people look at physics as, just really boring science, but to me, physics is magic, you
Yeah.
know.
And there's some amazing mind-bending stuff going on in there, I tell you. So,
Absolutely, like knot
yeah.
theory is wild,
Yeah.
and so to me, I cannot separate the two. So I feel like I have this kind of hybrid of, really being rooted in science and
Yeah.
what I can see and what I know, these absolute facts, and the absolute facts that there is so much more that is unknown that I know that I feel, you
Yeah.
know. So yeah, that's what I do. And I don't have a specific religion that I ascribe to, because I've always kind of chalk that up to the fact that I'm an Aquarius and we don't follow anybody's rules. However,
Yeah.
However, there's nothing that feels good to me that, that I can hold to solely, but I do practice a lot of things that come from different African ancestral traditions, and do follow a lot of those tenets, but not strictly.
Yeah, yeah, I've got it. Yeah, yeah. In a queer way where you won't follow the rules. You just
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
So it
Queer
does.
everything.
Yeah, so it does feel like you've gone back to some of those elements that you talked about, maybe in Africa, about Caribbean cultures that were around and infused through the culture before
Mhm.
colonial, and frankly, the imposition of Christianity and so on. So you picked up some of those themes and reflecting them in your life. And would it make sense to describe that as a sense of spirit and connection and wonder and maybe transcendence and a sense of things that can't be known but that you feel? It's a combination of some of those things. Is there a sense of a deity in the way you think, as in a sort of all-powerful being, or is it more a sort of sense of multiple universes and connectedness with other
Yeah,
entities?
I think that mm, so I think I don't have the answers, but I also think again that I know what I feel. And
Yeah,
so I cannot believe in one all powerful, all seeing, but benevolent and sometimes malevolent being,
yeah,
right?
quite
Because
often malevolent.
right, it was like like all of these fair God, like why, how, what? But God is love, though.
Yeah.
Okay. um
I'm not sure
you
how the
know
creation of hell is consistent with God being love, as just one
and then
example, but yeah.
exactly, because then when you think about that, all of a sudden there's this altar who is, you know incredibly malevolent and incredibly powerful. So I don't believe in that
Yeah.
per se, but I do believe in the fact that folks can be harmed to the point of malice, anger, and just horror, right? And that has to be true, to me. Of there's some entities out there who may be stuck in that. I believe that. I believe in the power of my ancestors. I believe that if I look back, and open up my vision, I can see thousands, thousands and thousands of past energies, spirits, whatever you want to call it, that are connected to me
Yeah.
deeply. I can feel it in my blood. And I do believe that some of those have exalted to the point where they've gotten so much knowledge by being around, that you can call them deities. So I
Yeah.
believe in a pantheon of deities, but I cannot single one out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. No, that's fascinating. And it strikes me that as we move on to the next big question about ethics and morality, I'm fascinated by how these two big questions relate, because it strikes me that in many of the established religions, the sort of more formalized ones, whether it's Islam or Christianity or something else, often there is a deity. Often there's quite a formulaic structure of rules. Personally, it feels to me like those rules were generally written by powerful men hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, and you can see that in the ethics that they drive through. And what those systems of thought seem to do to me, there is a lot of compassion there. There is community there. There's many good things there as well. There's love, unconditional love, and so on. But there's also, it strikes me that the compassion is often constrained. So, only a certain team get the compassion. You're in the in group, you get the compassion. If you're not, unlucky and you might burn for eternity. And often the compassion is conditional as well. We follow the rules, you'll be okay. If you don't, woe betide you. So there seems to be quite a strong effect on ethics from an established religious worldview often. And it's not all bad. Sometimes it can be good as well, but there's a danger of a warping of compassion.
Mm.
Now, it strikes me with people who have a different flavor of, if you like, a supernatural worldview that is more about a spiritual connection, and there isn't a single all-powerful deity, and it's less formulaic, that there's it seems to me that there's much less risk of warping of compassion or undermining of compassion, because you don't have the rules that say, we're good, they're bad, they should be punished. And you also don't have some sort of superordinate goal in the name of which terrible things can be done. The classical story of Abraham and his son, and was on the brink of killing his own son because God said it was the good thing to do. And that cuts to the heart of the challenge, I think, with some religious ethics, is that their compassion isn't really about caring about the other for its own sake. Ultimately, you're really only doing that because God told you to do it. And if God tells you to do something that isn't compassionate, that's what you should do. I mean, so again, it's a little frustrating. But I don't know if that resonates with you, is that maybe the more established, formalized religions can have more of a dangerous ethical impact, and whereas a more broad spiritual sense, and there are so many varieties of that, has less risk of warping ethics. Am I being too generous, or do you think that plays?
Yeah, I don't think that there's going to be a difference. I think it's all depends on the person,
Yeah.
and it depends on the people and the way that collective, that formation comes into being. If there and also what develops in that space too. You could start out lovely, loving, compassionate, all of these wonderful things, and then degrade into like a toxic space because there was harm somewhere that wasn't talked about, I wasn't handled. I see the biggest potential for more compassion being in the practice itself, like how the people define the practice.
Yeah.
I don't believe that, say, Christianity, which is what I know. I can't speak about anything else that I don't really know well. But in terms of the single deity structure, right?
Yeah.
But I can tell you, I don't believe Christianity was built with compassion in mind. I believe that it was really developed as um, in a way to tell a story, to make sense of the world, but also to have a system of control.
Yeah.
As gregarious beings, let's just be really real. As the types of animals that we are, we tend to think we need, let's say, a system, a structure to the world and to organizing ourselves in groups. And what can happen there, though, is, again, these toxic interpretations. So, not to tell people that if you're a Christian, you're wrong, right? But to say, like, really interrogate the practice now.
Yeah.
Because just like something more compassionate can get toxic, something toxic can be made more compassionate. I don't know if that answers the question.
It does. I like it, and I think it's important to apply that test to people with this sort of purely naturalistic scientific worldview as well, because you see the same diversity of challenges there, right? You can find rationales for homophobia and sexism and racism and anti-Semitism and worldview bigotry in Christians, and you can find other Christians who are vehemently against all of those things and universally compassionate. I think you can find all of those bad things in people with a completely naturalistic, atheistic worldview as well, and people who are virulently against it. So, yeah. So I think you can see the influences sometimes, but I think you're right. It's not a sort of deterministic drive. It's about the practice of each individual and how they put that into play. Thank you. So I think we do, differ in terms of our worldviews, but even the way you describe that, there's still quite a lot of overlap with some of the things I feel too. So that sense of transcendence and connection, that sense of possibility of, many worlds that you said, there's schools of thought within modern physics that replicate that. Many of those senses, which some might describe as spiritual experiences, I feel those too, even from quite a hard-edged naturalistic scientific worldview. So I think there's interesting overlaps between the way people feel and the way people connect with the universe, even if the actual underpinning worldviews are very different. But
I think just like art there's no science without art. I think that there's also no science without soul, right? Um, and we are absolutely minds in a body, and our minds can do things outside of our body that we're just now starting to understand even just the tiniest bit of it. So yeah, I think that's why we have these feelings,
Yeah.
It's impossible not to.
Thank you. Well, let's come on to the second of these crazily big questions. What matters? And then who matters? Again, for most of my guests, this is a story about originally how they grew up and how they started to think about ethics, often originally in quite a childlike way, but then over time, how did that change? And there's two parts to this question, and I shouldn't really ask them together, but I'm going to do it now, and you can decide how you want to navigate through it. So the first one is, what matters in terms of what is good and bad? What are right and wrong? What do those concepts even mean to you, given your worldview? And the second question is, who gets to count? Who warrants our compassion? Who should get moral consideration? And that's what, again, a fascinating journey to hear people go through as they think about, myself, my family, my community, and how that scope of moral consideration evolves and changes over time. So there's two crazily broad questions, but I'll let you talk us through the story of how you think about your own ethics and morality.
Yeah, thank you. So as a child, I grew up eating meat and fish and all of, my mother would always get mad at me. Why are you dissecting your food? Because I would be pulling out veins and, you know, cartilage and fat and all these things, and I'd see it as like this is a body here, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and it was too much for my mother, my grandmother. It just couldn't handle it. I'm like, why like this child won't eat, um, and so as a child, like it took a while to make the connection between, oh, this is a body, and I made the connection when I finally figured out how they slaughter, how animals are slaughtered, and I saw it happening, and so that still didn't stop me from eating meat until again from stopping eating meat until I was 14. But when I did that, it was because I found other people who felt the same, and I wasn't made to feel strange about it. I finally felt like, oh, I'm not alone. I'm not a weirdo. I can do this. And other people are doing it and they're not dead, you know.
Yeah, amazing.
Right? Because that was the other thing, like, oh, you're gonna starve. That was the other conversation that my mother would have with me. And so my ethics have always leaned towards the those of us who are in the facing the most harm. And so for me, that's where I always go back to who is the most harmed by this system, this person, this space, whatever. Who is going to be the most harmed, and who has been left out of the conversation around how we deal with this harm?
Yeah. And
Right.
what's that? And that concern for the ones who are being the most harmed, did that come from a sense of justice and fairness and wanting to resist the oppression, or was it coming from a place of compassion and empathy for the victims, or both? And did that vary depending on whether we're talking about humans and non-humans, or?
I think that over the years it has developed differently, but it was always both, right?
Yeah.
You cannot have justice without compassion in some way, right? Like I don't believe in the death penalty because I don't believe in the power of the state to kill someone for killing someone.
Yeah.
I don't believe in the power of the state, period. You know? So there's also that. But what has evolved though, I think also as we get older, we start to understand the nuance of life and living it. And so now when I think of things, and again, I'm evolving, right? When I think of who gets the compassion, I cannot see a world that transforms without everyone getting it. Even the
Yeah.
people who are the most harmful, even the people who misuse their privilege, even the people who, are unrepentant in their in their embracing of evil, or what we consider like something that's wrong, right? Um, so that to
And
me tells
that's a really hard step to take. And I'm not
yes,
I don't think many people I don't think have taken it, because they will talk about universal compassion and they'll talk about resisting all oppression, but they can't bring themselves to feel compassion for the perpetrators. And I you can understand that, but it's not truly universal unless it's universal. But
yes, absolutely. And it's taken me a long time to get there, Jamie. It is so hard. It is so hard. As a survivor of very very storied and different types of violence, it is very difficult to sit here and say to you that I will find a way to hold the people who have enacted violence against me, right? Um, and that doesn't mean that that's my job in life,
yeah,
also. So I want to make sure that I'm clear on that, because it's very easy for these words to be used, to continue to perpetuate harm. So, and then also the truth is that Black femmes in the world are routinely the bearers of the emotional burdens of morality, and I'm not here to do that,
yeah,
or open roads for anyone else to be that. So what I'm really saying though is that what I'm learning as within the work that I do now, what I'm learning is that it takes a lifetime to really understand the amount of harm that we do to each other. And it takes just probably another lifetime to understand the ways in which that can show up in each person. And so taking that into consideration, I'm really working hard to give folks the grace that I need, right? However, that doesn't mean that we're going to excuse people. There's ways to hold people accountable that is generous to you and to that person as well.
yeah.
So
And
I believe in that. Mhm.
and having compassion even for perpetrators doesn't mean appeasement, and it doesn't mean weakness, and it doesn't mean that you allow or enable that harm to continue. I think you're right. It can be done. You can hold people to account. You can still have justice. You can still have firmness and clarity and ethical clarity, but still maintain a universal compassion. But like you say, it's
Right.
hard work.
Absolutely. And it also doesn't mean that you don't defend yourself.
Yeah.
Let's also be clear there.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely. Yeah,
yeah.
you need to have compassion for yourself and the victims too, and that may even require, quite strident, harsh actions in some situations. But
Hmm.
yeah, and
Absolutely.
so you talked about that quite natural sense of your compassion went beyond other humans to other animals too. Did that come from early experiences, or was that something you just always just intuitively felt that they are moral patients too? That harming them matters.
Yeah. I think it was both things. I think it's something I intuitively felt, but something that my growing up, I saw so much. I was the proverbial tomboy, right? I was always just really dirty. Just, running around barefoot all the time, getting into adventures, all of these things. And I would be the one girl with the boys. And when that happened, these boys we would be in the same mindset. To the point is to have fun, but for sometimes their idea of fun was killing something or someone else, and that didn't make sense to me. So I would have to always was the voice of reason, or I tried to be. Often I was shouted out or ignored. Um, so they would be practicing their slingshots. We have, I don't know if you realize, but the Caribbean is a throughway for migratory songbirds. So that we have birds that are endemic who live in Jamaica full time, but also pass through. And so these glorious birds, like beautifully colored, beautifully singing birds, you know, but they're little. And so that's a nice target if you're learning how to, shoot a slingshot, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they would be practicing and trying to kill these birds and sometimes succeeding. And my heart would break. I would cry, but of course I couldn't let them see me cry too much because it was like, oh, yes, why we have this girl here anyway, so that was really one of the things. And then when I was about 6 or 7, living in the countryside in Jamaica, we went to go to this woman's house to get a cake, my mother and I. And we drove up, and my mother's going to get the cake. And as we're driving up, there's a goat that is strung up, by their legs. And we realized that position is for slaughter. And my mother quickly ran as fast as she could, got the cake, and we got out of there, but that, like, hearing those screams was too much for me, you know? And so that, I think, just being so close to nature, I didn't have a lot of toys. In Jamaica at the time, we had one TV station. So, and it didn't come on all day. So
Yeah.
I was outside, I was playing with spiders and lizards and all of these other species and in interspecies communication all the time, you know, and I could not imagine anyone not seeing them as whole. Why would you not, you know? And so again, I was always, it's not that I was made to feel bad about it, but I was always made to feel different about that feeling. When I realized what I knew in my heart, that to me, this is the only way. I don't
It's
understand,
just obvious. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an
Yeah.
obvious thing. So, I was grateful to come to animal liberation space in that way. But then, actually, it usually just happens in reverse, where people come to social justice space and then find animal liberation space. But I found it the opposite, because I did not find full compassion there, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
found high key racism, homophobia, you know, seriously deep commitment to patriarchy in the space. And I was young, and that hurt me so much. And through that, though, I was able to find movement space. I was able to find Black liberatory spaces. I was able to find spaces that, were womanist space, and also spaces that are trans and queer, that are Black and Indigenous spaces as well. And so there's where we see true generosity happening, because we always hold each other when we're in the fight against oppression. We hold each other really well when we're the ones that we're working to liberation for,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, but again, because we're doing that work, it doesn't mean that there's not spaces where there's a blind spot. And oftentimes where the blind spot is for non-humans, and is for Earth also,
Yeah. And that's what it would be fascinating to come on to that now in our, the final question we ask, which is how can we make a better world? Because you've been a biologist, an anthropologist, and environmentalist, but your activism covers so many different dimensions. And you talked already there about a real challenge in so many different parts of the activist world where they're very focused on a particular topic or a particular agenda that they're normally right about. They understand it, but that focus maybe has led them to neglect or obfuscate or sometimes even perpetuate other forms of oppression. So you've talked in many places, and you talked there about coming into the animal liberation movement and hitting some of those social justice problems and seeing them going on within the movement. There's another, I think, analogous challenge going on, and has been going on for years, in another area that I'm vaguely familiar with the sort of atheist, secularist, skeptic movement as well, which is, been pushing for, equal rights for non-religious people and challenging blasphemy laws and trying to resist religiously motivated discrimination and, support all of its aims. But that movement also seems to be really struggling with multidimensional social justice, not just as a cause, but actually within their own movement. So there's a challenge in the animal liberation movement. There's a challenge within the atheist and in the atheist and secular area and free thinking movements, if you like, the rationalist movement. And it's also a challenge in the environmental movement as well, because as you say, the environmental movement has a massive blind spot around non-human animals and particularly animal agriculture and its role in environmental and climate damage. How do you feel about that challenge of allowing groups to focus where we need priority without making other problems worse and perpetuating other problems? But on the flip side, how do we avoid having a sort of total liberation or against all oppression stance that is so broad that it flattens difference and maybe hides diversity? And I don't know, it's a crazily broad question. What's your sense of how we can best to go about all that?
Yeah. So I believe in tenets of total liberation, right? I don't think it's possible to have a liberatory space if you're not seeing all the people in it, you know, right? And so I think that what happens a lot of times is that we get so caught up in, and we always say in the weeds, right? We get caught up, honestly, not in the weeds, but we get caught up in the soil. Like I feel like we're counting grains of dirt a lot of the time. You know? But I do believe that that spaces need to interrogate interrogate their integrity, right? And also interrogate your mission. Oftentimes, we write these beautiful mission statements and walk away from them. We plaster them on our websites and all of these things, but at no point, or maybe yearly, at whatever retreat we do, we'll come back and be like, oh yeah, that was a mission, huh? But if you can't operationalize each of the sentences in there under with the information from everybody, right? Then it's not going to happen. And so I don't know, I may be rambling now, but I feel as though like I wrote a piece in Queer and Trans Voices, Achieving Liberation Through Anti-Oppression. And I wrote a piece that said, don't include me, right? And folks are like, what are you talking about? We're supposed to be inclusive. No, if you have to include me, you left me out, right? And also, if you have to include me, that means that you had a checklist. So, right? And if you have a checklist, that means that you did not have the people in your corner, at your side, in the first place. And so then your mission was false to begin with. So we really have to not only be kind, right? But stop using kindness as an opportunity to push an agenda that is too narrow. So I don't see us flattening out if we bring folks the best foot forward from everyone,
Yeah, I like that. Thank you. And it strikes me there's sometimes also a bit of a presumption in this sort of extension and inclusion. It's like, I'm doing the including. I have my list. I have that, and it relates because through these conversations, I've shifted the way I talk to a degree as well, because I used to talk a lot about the sort of the moral circle and how the moral circle expands out, and I think that's a useful concept. But again, there's an implication that me and my group are in the middle, and that we are extending generously to others, and it's like, well, okay. So and that's partly why I don't really talk about a moral circle anymore, just because of those implications. I talk more about moral scope, and And I think that's one of the things that's implied in this idea of sentientism, and this granting moral consideration unconditionally and unquestionably to every sentient being, any being that can experience suffering gets to matter, is that it's many people will focus clearly on the non-human animal implications of that, i.e. completely ending animal farming and exploitation, just because that's the topic that so starkly clashes with default human behaviour and social norms today. But it also includes an explicit stance about how we think about other humans, all of whom are sentient beings too. It has implications for our intrahuman ethics as well, and has that stance of anti-oppression, total liberation, all humans are sentient beings, and so on and so forth. Again, that doesn't need to flatten it. It doesn't mean everyone is the same. We don't need different considerations. We don't have different interests. We don't have different needs. We don't have different beliefs. And also, we don't need to take the same sort of advocacy and change approaches in every field and with every group either. I mean, you can have a very generous moral scope and recognise dazzling, brain-bending diversity within that across species and within the human species.
Yeah, I mean, you have to. I mean, so first of all, the other thing is that I don't like about inclusion is that not everybody wants to be with you.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to sit at some tables. A lot of tables, actually. I turned on a lot of tables.
Yeah. I might be doing my own thing with a different group of. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Because there's spaces that are sacred, right? Black space is sacred, you know. Trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary space, that's sacred, you know. And it's necessary, and it's important to me that folks stop looking for themselves in those spaces. If it's not yours, it's not yours, and move on. But if it, you know what I mean? And so that's where that's where the internalized oppression comes in. And that's where the buying in to oppression comes in. If you have to, you know what I mean? And that's also where harm comes from too. So there's also that. Another thing I was going to say,
and I think
too,
on that point, I think you can have moral consideration for all sentient beings without insisting they're all in one group with you. They can,
right.
Yeah.
That's where I was going to go, because also, you know, if we take biology, for instance, right? It is a study of life on the planet. At no point does biology say that one, it has defined all life on the planet, but two, that all life on the planet exists in the same way. You know, in fact, the term biodiversity explains just that. The necessitation of the necessity, sorry, of all of each of the species that exist in an area, right, for the functioning of that ecosystem, and the necessity of that ecosystem next to a different type of ecosystem. So oftentimes I talk about an ecosystem of movements, right? They can move together and share information between spaces too. You know, to me, that's a better way to look at inclusion and morality too. And I also think it is so rude. It's a little rude of us to think that we also can speak for animals. That happens all the time. You got to speak up for animals. Oh, okay, did they ask you? You know, when was the last time that you had a true conversation with a cow or a chicken? You know, and when we actually do get to have those conversations, our lives are changed by it. So instead of putting ourselves, but to me, that's speciesism as well, you know? So instead of putting ourselves at the center, what we can think is, you know, let me help facilitate conversations with, you know, cows and chickens, right? And those are always going to look different. So I do think that we really need to remove ourselves. This is like when we started this conversation, you said, you know, like some of these religions were mostly started by, you know, groups of men with power to, you know, get more power. This is the same situation. So you have to remove yourself from, you know, the center of power, you know, in as many ways as possible.
And I think there's the risk there, and I see some people following this path, is that they step out and then abandon the victims. So there's almost a degree to which they say, I'm so skeptical of our ability as humans to do good in the world, human hubris, and look at the harm we've done. Maybe we just need to back away and step out, and we can't speak for the non-human animals. And that's a mistake too. You can find the middle ground where you can have compassion, you can advocate, you can try to help and assist and support, but without putting yourself in front and representing where it's not appropriate, or putting your own interests and needs in the place of the needs and interests of others. But it can be a tricky balance sometimes. But I don't think it's that hard, really.
No, yeah, it takes rigorous practice. Everything's a practice, no?
Yeah. Yeah.
Life is a practice.
So one thing I'd be fascinated to understand is, one, generally, how do you think about making positive change happen in different spaces? And if you want to draw on some of your work with the Cypher or Black Veg Fest or your environmental work, that would be fascinating to hear. But I guess there's so many different case studies. There's different communities where you might take a different approach to advocacy and a different style. I'd be interested in your thoughts about, just very generically in the US, how you see positive change happening, both for humans and non-humans. But I'm also interested in your sense, looking back at Jamaica, at how you think positive change might happen there differently, again, for humans and non-human animals. So again, another crazily big question, but how do you think about, effective advocacy and driving good change in those very different contexts?
Well, the first thing I would say is we don't have enough time to explain that. But second,
sorry.
No, that's okay, because second, I think it's important to bring these questions up over and over again, and that way we make time, right? So I think that it's important to let the folks doing the work for their folks do that work. And that's why, so I'm going to try and make maybe 4 different points on each thing that you said. So with Black Veg Fest, right? I started with Black Veg Fest just saying like, hey, I'll come through and do whatever, And I'd been there for the first festival, the second festival in Brooklyn, and then I was asked to come on as an organizer, and in Black Veg Fest space, we do work specifically for our folks are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, but our focus is Black liberation. So our focus is Black folks, and what that means is that we are going into the areas where our folks have been routinely the most stepped on by the oppressive structures and systems that we live under. I will always quote bell hooks and talk about white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy, right? Those are heavy words that always need to be brought into space and to be defined. And I'm not going to define them here right now, but when we do that, we're talking about folks who are poor, who are in low income areas, folks who have a whole wealth of knowledge that is routinely denied. And so we work with those folks to, talk about things from a very meeting folks where they're at level. You could call it popular education, whatever you want, and speaking to their needs specifically. And so when we're talking about what is happening with dairy cows or factory farming, we're talking about it from a perspective of understand where everyone is on the continuum of that food production and what happens to you at the end, in terms of health issues and things like that. And then we are also in other movement spaces where we are talking specifically about how do we move the boot off of Black folks' neck, and we're doing it in a way I said yes to organizing because I had never been in a Black space where folks intentionally said, we are working to do this work. We are working to center all the folks, all Black folks, and that doesn't necessarily happen a lot in spaces. So there's that. But it takes talking to the people, and to me, remembering, again, following a bell hook strategy, that all folks hold knowledge. You're not here to preach to people. That doesn't usually work well,
Yeah.
And so I'm developing this formation of the cipher, and we're working, to build a trans and queer Black femme-led collective that holds all queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of the global majority, people of color specifically, holds us, um, and uses gender equity as a guidepost, but it's always about Black liberation. It's always about a vegan construct, right? And talking about environmental justice and food justice in a way that meets and trans and queer folks where they are, and when we have trans and queer spaces, we're talking about how we keep each other safe. We're talking about survival, but we're not talking about survival as it pertains to the whole world of the ecosystem that we're in, which is climate change is real and it's happening right now, and it's going to hurt us first. We have to talk about that, and we have to develop strategies for more than resilience, and as people who are harmed, how can we possibly perpetrate harm by not including non-humans into our conversation? And then also the fact that, again, we're crunched under by that same system all the way through the system. So it's deepening these conversations to tease out all of these things. And in that deepening, we move the conversation forward and elevate it again and again and again, And that's happening in the US, but I think it's happening a lot. I think it's happening a lot in the UK. It's happening a lot in Germany with a lot of the Black vegans I've seen doing work there. And in Jamaica, this is happening too. There is a wonderful resurgence of, Jamaican folks taking the land back. That is a beautiful thing,
Yeah.
Community control of land is a huge issue, right? It is unfortunately the product of colonization, and remembering that the entire world has been affected by this reality of the past 600 years,
Yeah. And
Um,
land ownership is one of the starkest ways you can understand how that history is present in the present day. And it's interesting
Absolutely.
because even in the UK, you can
Mhm.
see the flip side of that based on who owns the land even here. No,
Exactly.
and we were the colonizing country, the colonizing empire, but you can see the patterns of that colonization in who has the wealth and who owns the land here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then exactly what they do with it too.
Yeah.
What is a lawn? You know, like a lawn is not a lawn has to do with, royalty and, who like separating yourself from, the serfs, right? So but in general in Jamaica, that's what's happening because we're noticing this the neo-colonization, neoliberal strategies that are being used and have torn our country apart, and a lot of that is because we tried to do something, so the IMF had came and decimated us. World Bank came and decimated us. And it's just like other forms of colonization. So for countries like Jamaica, to me, the way forward to real change is to listen to the Jamaicans and use the truths that we've seen happen, you know, our histories, our lineages of, what we call in Jamaica, like you say, you catch on the land or you catch somewhere, you sit on the side of a seat, you're catching,
Yeah.
right? And so a lot of the land use is people who don't actually own that land, but produce the products that are making the country money, And so it's upending that structure again. Is being the most harmed? To put them in the front, give them the things that they need, to thrive. And also looking at the facts of science. A lot of the science that is coming, from and to Jamaica right now is not happening in a way that is sustainable. It's one-off studies and things like that. And Jamaica is a hotspot of biodiversity,
Yeah.
but yet we are high on the list in the world for deforestation. So how does that equate? It equates because tourism is the number one moneymaker. And so we're going to sell ourselves out cheap. We're going to, cut down mangrove forests that would protect the country from hurricanes, provide space for fish and invertebrates to, to develop and thrive and grow and become, the bountiful ocean life that we have. But we take that out and we decide to put, docks for cruise ships or the next all-inclusive Sandoz hotel,
Yeah.
something like that. So it is talking about wealth in a different way, looking at wealth as the land, as the folks, as the knowledge that we hold, as our histories, our true histories, right?
Yeah.
Right? Not the what is told by the victors, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, it's a focus not on money, but on on the wealth of who we are and what we are.
Yeah. So it's putting the people with the greatest need at the center of the solutions and the knowledge, and it's while focusing on their needs and their interests, it's also trying to take an approach that is against all other forms of oppression as well. And again, that can seem like a difficult thing to do, and I think that's why some people who want to focus on a particular single issue sometimes push back. But in my amateur experience, what you find is the more broad your anti-oppression stance is, the more complementarity you find. And one of the topics that you and I take very seriously, animal agriculture, is just a great example of that. Transitioning to end that would be good for humans, it would be good for non-human animals, and it would be powerfully good for the environment we all share. And I think you find that even with intrahuman ethics as well. The more generous and more consistently anti-oppression, the more win-win situations you find and the more power you can build.
Yes, absolutely.
There's one final question I wanted to ask you, and this is a difficult one before I let you go. You've talked about the power and the threat and the damage of patriarchy and colonialism, and they have insidious threads that run through the present day in many respects. And I think most people would be very comfortable saying, yeah, those are things that need to be countered and rooted out and pulled back. You talked about capitalism as well. And that's another fascinating topic, because people who think of themselves as sentientists have a radically broad variety of different views on economics and politics. So there are anarchists and communists and socialists and some people who think we could get to a more compassionate capitalism, where if consumers and producers and regulators all have a sort of sentiocentric compassion where we care about other humans and we care about non-humans, you could re-engineer capitalism without having to, as my previous guest, I haven't released it yet, said, no, burn it all down. So what's your sense about economic systems and whether we need some, much more revolutionary approach, or whether there is a path to a sort of compassionate conservatism where we've ripped out all of the bad stuff? What's your sense about that? How radical do we need to be?
I think we need to, I don't think it's radical to be fully radical.
Yeah.
I think that honestly, that's the only way we're going to go. There is no way, I just don't see it, that capitalism can be re-engineered for good. Capitalism is a harmful construct. I'm going to always also quote Audre Lorde, that talking about the master's tools. You cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. It doesn't work like that. Even if those tools, let's also be clear, were fashioned after the tools that you had.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because there's also a co-opting that happens all the time, So I can't tell you what's best, right? But I can say that this isn't it.
Yeah.
And I just don't see any way to tear apart something that turns whole beings into units of production
Yeah.
to make it more compassionate.
Yeah.
It feels absolutely possible.
And I don't know the answer either, but it's difficult because the most positive reading of capitalism, if you like, and I know you won't like a positive reading of it, but the most positive way would be to say, look, in a way, it's about choice and freedom and fairness and opportunity. But the reality of the way it operates today, is you're saying, is that it just seems to lead to commodification and exploitation and over concentrations of power and a warping of democracy and politics. And yeah, so, some of my guests think there is a way of, reworking it. And many of them, I think, are with you and say, look, it's those problems are just so endemic to its structure that anything we need would be so different that it wouldn't warrant even having the same name. So, but yeah, a complicated topic. And overall, how does that leave you feeling as you think about different cultures and different groups and all of these different intersecting challenges we're facing? Do you feel some sort of optimism for the progress we might be able to make? Or do you have a more sort of pessimistic cast of mind, or neither? And again, thinking about intrahuman ethics and non-human animal ethics as well.
Yeah, I have to always believe that we will win.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The we I'm talking about is oppressed beings, yeah.
Yeah.
And the we is, all of the identities that I hold, and all the folks who I know are my siblings, in oppression. So I believe in liberation. I cannot not believe that liberation will happen in my lifetime. Otherwise, what's it for? And that means that we we find ways to continue on the path with the knowledge that there's going to be those days when you don't see it, you know but that doesn't mean that that's going to define what happens in the end.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, that's an inspirational, uplifting note to finish on. It's been a real inspiration to talk to you. It's been fascinating to understand your journey and to dip into these crazily big questions. So thank you. What's the best way of people following you, learning more about your work? I know you don't do much social media at the moment, but where would you point people for the main activism you're working on at the moment? And I can always update the show notes later on. So when you've got your social media up and running, let me know and I will go back and include the links.
I absolutely will let you know. So that's coming on the Cypher end. And I'm pretty incognito right now on the socials, but you can always find me at Black Veg Fest. My information is there at blackvegfest.org. And you can also put blackvegfest.com. It'll get you to the same website. And our IG also. That's where I'm doing my most work right now in movement space. And also I'm part of a collective called North Bronx Collective. You'll see a lot of the work that I've been doing there as well. So, but you can also find me on shows like this, work that folks are doing to continue conversations and ask broad, hard, but necessary questions. And also in the street, I'm here in New York City, running around all the time. So, this is what's happening.
Come visit the Bronx. Yeah. Well, it's been an honor to have you as a guest on Sentientist Conversations. Thank you again, LoriKim, and stay in touch.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I really appreciate it so much. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.